Well, as we open our Bibles to the book of Job this week, I hope some of you at least have read through it yourselves in preparation for this Sunday. I think of all the books so far, I find Job the hardest to condense into a simple 20-minute, 30-minute talk. The complexity of the arguments and the topics that are being addressed just don't lend themselves to that kind of censorship. And it is a serious topic that Job brings to our attention. The problem of suffering is usually how it's referred to, and Job doesn't pull any punches. The book of Job dives into the issues that arise from real and perceived injustices in the world and takes them head on. There's no Sunday school answers in this book. They're complex. You have to think hard as you work through this book. So I thought perhaps we'd start on a light-hearted note. And some of you will get this cartoon and some of you won't. You must be Job. My name is Jabez. I'm your new neighbor. I can tell a few of you might have read the book of Jabez or the prayer of Jabez, the book that was very popular a couple of years ago. And if you didn't miss much, but not that it was a bad book. It was a good book. But it was very focused on one small prayer in the Bible and didn't take into account things like the book of Job in terms of the counsel of God. So nothing wrong with that, nothing wrong with Jabez's prayer, but Job too was a man of prayer, and the result or the outcome of his prayer life was quite different than Jabez. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry about it, but I thought some of you'd get a kick out of that. I know I did. One of the things we do, I think if we read the Old Testament correctly, is we make reference to Jesus in everything. We put on the glasses of the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then we read the Old Testament. And take, for example, the book of Job. Job is a type of Jesus. Both Jesus and Job had everything. Both of them lost everything. Both of them were tempted by Satan. Both of them were falsely accused of being sinners. Both suffered, though they did nothing wrong. Both remained faithful to God. Both were blessed more abundantly in the end. This is true of many stories in the Old Testament. Jonah follows the similar pattern. The life of Moses follows the similar pattern, and so on it goes. If we look through the eyes of the cross, as the New Testament says, the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus according to the Scriptures. And this is part of what it means to understand Jesus according to the Scriptures. You'll understand Jesus much more richly if you understand Job and how Job is a type. But I'm not going to preach that message today. I just throw it out there. It's interesting. It's important to see these things. And as I go through these books and summarize them in one Sunday, you understand that there's many more things we can talk about and would be worth going through in each of these books. But I just give that to you. Maybe you'll go back and read through Job with that lens and say, what do I see? What do I learn from that point of view? So when we open the book of Job or read a book or a commentary, and there's many, maybe more than any other Old Testament book has been written on the book of Job, because the problem of suffering is one that strikes us all. And if it hasn't hit your life hard yet, it will. We're all going to die. And in that process, there will be suffering. Some of us more, some of us less, but we're all going to have to deal with these issues. We're all going to have to wrestle with these truths, with these struggles. So how do you summarize a book like this in one sentence? In the book of Job, God says. What is God trying to communicate to us? What's the central idea? And I confess that as I've read the book of Job in the past, and I've read it many times because the last 5 chapters are probably some of my very favorite parts in the whole Bible. In the whole of Scripture, it's the most beautiful poetry. The ideas fill my mind with worship. And I just love it. But my confession is this. Most of the time when I've read Job, I've skimmed most of it. I like the first 2 chapters and the last 5. The middle is pretty dense. The middle is not something you can just read through. You have to think. You have to work at it. You have to pay attention to the words. And God doesn't tell us which of the words are wise and which are foolish. They're just presented to us in a great big argument, and we have to figure that out. We have to think hard, because there's a lot of wisdom in there and there's a lot of foolishness. And there's no little highlighter in the margin that says the red portions are God agrees with and the black portions God doesn't agree with. It doesn't say that. But as we read it, we know both of those are in there. And so we have to work at it. And it is in fact pretty dense. And that brings me to the Kinder Surprise. Because what happens with Job, most of the devotionals, books, commentaries I've read, deal mostly with the outside. The first 2 chapters and the last 5. And they talk about the problem of suffering and how God answers or doesn't answer but gives a different answer. There's all kinds of things like that. And they're good books. Like, there's nothing wrong with them, and they're not teaching false things. The only problem is there's 35 chapters in between. You've got to work a little harder to get that reward. And so I wonder if those of you who had a little egg had a chance to work on your reward in the center. That took a little more work than the outside. Can you bring them to me? What did you get? There we go. I'm going to leave them there. If you want them back, you can have them. Well, it's just to say that if you never had a Kinder Surprise before, which I assume all of you have had, but for the first time ever, if you were to have it, you'd think, oh, good, a chocolate egg. You eat the egg, but you quickly realize that there's something else inside there. And that something else has instruction, and it takes a little bit more work, but it lasts a little bit longer. So it's worth it. The reward that you work at lasts a little longer. So when I've looked at the book of Job before, and most of the treatments I've seen and heard of Job are trying to answer the question, what can I learn that will help me in my life from the book of Job? It's a good question to ask, and the answers that Job gives are good, profitable answers. And I had a little summary of that, but in the interest of time, I've cut it out. So you'll just have to figure that out yourself. Like I said, there's lots of books. But when I ask the question that I've been asking of each book of the Bible, it produces a different exercise in reading. Because the question is not, what can I learn for my life? But what is God trying to tell us that helps us know Him better? That's a different question. What is God trying to tell us? What is God revealing about Himself in the book of Job that we might know Him? Puts God in the driver's seat instead of me and my problems. I'm not saying it's wrong to read it the other way, but it's a different question. That's the one I want to work at this morning. I don't think I'll solve it. I think I've got a good start on it, though, and it's been quite a journey. The 35 chapters of argument in the middle. Maybe you'll go back and instead of skimming them this time, you'll read them through. So that's what we have. We have the situation. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Job, I'll just give it very quickly. Job is a righteous man. God Himself says that Job is righteous. So we don't know if he ever sinned or not or what that means, but it means that in God's judgment, Job is all right. He hasn't got sin on his account. He's righteous. He's right with God. And the accuser comes to the courtroom of God and says, well, yeah, but Job is only faithful and righteous because you've given him such great blessings. Let me play with him a bit and see if he stays faithful. And God agrees. And so the accuser goes and all of Job's children die. All of his wealth, all of his possessions are stolen, burned, taken away. And then his own physical health is attacked to the point where his wife curses him and goes away. He's left alone and suffering and in physical, emotional, mental pain. It's just as bad as it can get. And Job's three friends come, and that's the 35 chapters in the middle, and they argue with Job about what's happening and how to understand this suffering. Job never caves into their arguments. He considers them. He talks to them, but he doesn't cave into their arguments. In the end, God does answer Job's questions, Job's accusations that God is unjust. And God does speak in the last 5 chapters, and they're worth reading. They're, like I said, some of my favorite parts in the whole of Scripture. And then it's over. Well, Job gets a new family and new wealth and a new reward. But I think in the end we don't understand that as a reward so much as something else. We'll get to that maybe. The wisdom of Job's friends is, you can't summarize it. You understand that a summary always, it leaves out so much that it doesn't seem correct. But anyways, this is the summary. The summary of the friends of Job, their arguments is this: God is just, and he rules the world by justice. Therefore, if a human acts wisely and good, they will be successful and receive reward. And if a human acts in an evil way or a foolish or stupid way, their life will produce disaster and punishment. That's their argument. Now, their argument's much more sophisticated than that. It's really worth reading. They're wise men. They're the best the Middle East in that time had, and they're as good as anyone around today. They give good arguments, tight arguments, and they're worth wrestling through. But that's essentially a summary of their arguments. And we make the same arguments. I think we do. When I put it up stark like that, I say, oh no, Pastor, it's more nuanced than that. Well, yeah, it is. But it's essentially what we say. So let's talk about some of the wiggling we do around these arguments. So, for example, we do it this way. Well, God is just, and eventually, everything's going to turn out according to justice. So if you're struggling in life, perhaps you have unknown sin. Unconfessed sin. Things that you think are right, but actually aren't. Thought patterns. Something's wrong in there somewhere. Maybe you're not even aware of it, but pray to God that he'll reveal to you what's wrong so you can make it right and things will start going better in your life. So, I'll just say it right up front. I've made all of these arguments, so it's not just you. And it's a good argument. It could be true. Many times it is true. Even in my own life, I hide from sin and hide it even from myself. And the consequences are evident in my experience. Another one that we do and that Job's friends work on quite a bit is, I know it seems like there's no justice here, but just hang on a bit. It's going to work out in the end. This isn't the last story. This isn't the last chapter. If you really are righteous, it'll come around and reward you. The world works that way. So just hang in there. I know it seems harsh, but it's going to get better if you truly are a righteous man. And then we get into the more complicated things like I know you're suffering. I know you're depressed. I know you've got mental problems. I know you've got addiction. But you know what? It's really the sins of your parents. Now, you didn't do anything, but you grew up in that environment. So it's going to take you a while of living well and living truthfully to kind of pull yourself out of that pit that you were given as a starting point. And then there's the guilty by association. Well, I know you're not a bad person, but look who you hang out with. Look who you married. Look at your kids. Look what you watch. I know you didn't do any sin, but because you are so close to all this stuff, the punishment's going to hit you too. We make these arguments. We think these thoughts in our heads. Job's friends make these arguments very powerfully, very, very good arguments. And then as Christians, we have the trump card in here, right, in terms of God's justice. Even if we quote it out of context, Romans 3:23 has, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So whatever you got, you deserve. But God himself said Job was righteous. God himself made that declaration. It can't be false. And Job never gives up on it. He always says, I know, your arguments are good, but what I'm experiencing doesn't match what I've done or haven't done. It's not just. It's not right. And so, every time one of Job's friends makes an argument, Job comes back with a reply. And Job is all over the place. His friends have tight, concise, logical arguments. Job says one thing, then he says the opposite, then he contradicts himself, then he praises God, then he curses God, then he wishes he was dead, then he loves the beauty in the world. He's everywhere. But he never gives up on this one thing. I didn't do enough wrong to deserve this suffering. He never gives up. He never pleads guilty. Just to give you an example, the worst and the best, right next to each other. If we look at Job chapter 9, verse 22, Job says this: it is all the same. That is why I say, he destroys, that is, God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. When the land falls into the hands of the wicked, he blindfolds its judges. If it is not he, then who is it? Job is accusing God in no uncertain terms of being unjust. He just willy-nilly kills people and harms people, whether they're good or bad, just for the fun of it. That's about as close as you can get to blasphemy without actually committing blasphemy. I don't think there's another step, maybe not even a half step. And then just a few verses later, the same chapter, in verse 33, Job says this: God is not a mere mortal like me, that I might answer him, that we might confront him with each other in court. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as of it now stands, I cannot. And here he's just verses later, just moments later, he's saying, no, God is just. It's just that we don't have a way to bridge between. We sense the longing in God's heart, and now we can give the Sunday school answer, because what's always the right answer in Sunday school? Who is it that Job is longing for? Come on, say it. Jesus. He doesn't know Jesus. Jesus hasn't been born yet, but this is the longing of his heart. He knows this is the answer. If only there was a mediator between our limited, sinful perspective and God's glorious, just, beautiful perspective. If only there was someone who could stand between and take the punishment, take the rod that we deserve. That would be an adequate answer to the problem. And it is. But remember, I'm not talking about that this Sunday. That is a good message to take from Job, but we can't do them all in 1/2 hour. So explore that. Look into it. Jesus is the answer to that question, and it's not just the Sunday school answer. It's complex and beautiful and runs through all of Scripture. But these are Job's replies. Let me come to this place. We're going to have to move on from those arguments and come to conclusions. But can we at least agree that we're not always comfortable with the way things turn out? Can we at least agree that it doesn't always seem right to us? that it sometimes seems like God isn't just. Even though we believe he is, but sometimes it doesn't seem that way. We don't see the evidence all the time. And if you're saying, nope, Pastor, I can't agree with that, just wait. A day will come when you agree. A day will come. I remember a parishioner in another place. He lived as good a life as anyone I knew. Anyone I've ever known. I don't know. I don't need to go into details. You know what that means. He lived as good a life as anyone. He was a grandparent, had beautiful grandchildren, living a good life. And he came down with lung cancer. He'd never smoked a cigarette in his life. And just across the road, his neighbor, I'm telling you, you've never met a person before. Despicable. Like not just chain smoking, but like just the kind of person that every one of you would be tempted to go to the other side of the street if you see him coming. Like you just know if you get into that conversation, it's not going to be just good morning, how's the weather. There's going to be all kinds of language and complaining and stuff, and it's just too much to deal with. And that chain smoker lived a good long life without lung cancer. And the parishioner's wife struggled with that. Why did my husband die? He's a good man. I wanted him around some more. It's not right, God, that evil guy living next door gets to live and gets to hold his grandkids, even though he abuses them. I don't think he was like abusive to go to jail, but not nice. And my grandkids don't get their grandfather. Can we at least agree that we're not entirely comfortable with the way things turn out all the time? Not always entirely comfortable with God's decisions. Because that's what Job presents to us. Then comes the last argument. Elihu. He's a younger man. He's not one of the three that goes back and forth, but right at the end of this section of the book, he comes out and gives an argument, and he's more sophisticated than the others. And his argument is basically this: God is just, you're right, and he runs the world according to justice, but suffering is not always a punishment for sin. Sometimes God brings suffering into our lives because it's going to produce good things. It's going to produce character. It's going to prepare us for what he wants us to do. Ever heard that argument before? Just listen. Romans chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. That's the hope of Job, right? His longing for a mediator. And here's the continuing argument here. Paul goes on. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. It's the same argument that Elihu makes. It's a good argument. It's a biblical argument. It's true. But Job doesn't buy it. Job says, I've got enough character. I don't need this much suffering to get there. And here's the thing. He's right. God has declared him righteous. God has said to the accuser, here's a man of character. No matter what you do to him, he's going to still honor me. There's no deeper, stronger character than that. So, as the saying goes, two things can be true at the same time. It is true that God brings suffering to build our character. Or that when suffering does come, we can gain from it things that are valuable. But that doesn't mean we're satisfied with the justice of the situation. Another thing that we say, I'm going to add here, Elihu hints at it, but he doesn't really talk about it. But in in Christian circles, we do this. Romans 12:19. Do not avenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. And Hebrews 10:30 and 31. For we know him who said, it is mine to avenge, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And the argument there is, I know it's hard. I know you're suffering. But in the end, in eternity, God will bring it all to justice. And it's true, but it doesn't satisfy us. It's true. It will happen. But yet we feel terrible when we suffer. Because the amount of suffering doesn't seem to match the amount of wrongdoing. And so we struggle with it. So what I'm saying here is I'm not knocking down those arguments. They're good arguments. They're wise arguments. But there's something missing. And if we look around today, there's no shortage of people who make good arguments. I could list names, but maybe I'll refrain from that. But if we go maybe in our day what would be a little bit more to the right is my right, your left, I don't know which way it goes. We get arguments like this. Make your bed, stand up straight, finish high school, don't get pregnant before you're married, and stick with the one you have kids with for the rest of your life. And things will be all right. And it doesn't matter how bad your life is, how much suffering is. Get on these things, and it's going to turn out. It's going to improve. And it's good advice, and it's true advice, but it doesn't always work. A lot of times it does, but not always. And then if you go more on the left, my left, your left. If you go more on the left, you get more of a group think, but it's the same thing. And the idea is that, I know you're suffering, but you know what? How you can find meaning in life is just, pull yourself together with other people and overcome that a bit and work together towards the betterment of this planet. And all together we'll make this a better place. And maybe not in our lifetime, but in our children's lifetime, it'll be what you're hoping for. And they're good arguments. And there's a lot of truth in it. But it's missing something. What does God say about all of this? Because God does make a pronouncement. After the arguments, after he's shown Job all the glories of the universe and made his case in that way, we have this sentence. I find it surprising. I don't know if you will, but I find it surprising, but true. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, and that's the leader of the friends, I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. What? Job, you mean the guy that said God isn't just? That God might even be evil? The guy that said it would be better if my mother hadn't even conceived me? Be better if I'd never lived? That guy spoke the truth about God? And we recognize truth throughout the arguments of the friends. So what in the world is God saying? Job, you're the one that spoke truth about me. Your friends didn't. That's God's judgment on the situation. We need to back up just a little bit to understand this. It has to do with, guess, relationship. It has to do with relationship. The truth of relationships is what God's after. God wrote this book so that we could know him, so we could be in relationship with him. It's always his focus. Love. Love is about relationship. God is love. So let's back up a little bit into the argument that God makes. And so God displays before Job the wonders of the universe. And I'm not going to reread it. As I said, it's my favorite part of the Bible. And he just, in the most beautiful, poetic back and forth of ideas, he brings together this incredible display of his glory and his power and his control. And essentially what he's making is what we know today as the butterfly hypotheses. Do any of you know the butterfly hypotheses? So I'm not going to quote Job. You can read that yourself. I'm going to give the argument in a different way, a fresh way. I'm sure it won't be as good as the way God made it in Job, but here we go. The butterfly hypotheses. This is what it says. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, there's a butterfly on a branch high in the tree. And the butterfly flaps its wing to take off. And that wing makes a small, little, tiny puff of breeze. And there's a leaf sitting precariously on the branch that is unbalanced by the puff of wind that comes off the butterfly's wing. And that leaf falls off the branch. And as it tumbles down through the rainforest, it dislodges several other leaves and twigs. And they all land in this tiny little rivulet of water that's running underneath the tree. And as they run along that bit of water, they come to a branch that's across, and they get stuck there under the branch and stop the water. And the water backs up just a little bit. And as it backs up, it slows down, and more debris stops. And over the course of a couple of days, it makes kind of this sedimentary dam. And the forest floor that was all dry before is now covered in water. There's a swamp where there was dry land. That swamp's only going to be there for 2 days before the water pushes away that debris and everything goes back to normal. But during those 2 days, the sun shines down on that swamp. And the water evaporates and makes a small cloud. And that little cloud joins a bigger cloud. And that bigger cloud joins a bigger cloud. And eventually those clouds get together into a hurricane that comes up the Florida coast. And it comes up the Florida coast. And of course, we're not a bit worried about that because we're in Alberta, right? But we hear it on the news and all that. And there's tendrils of wind that come off that hurricane. And they come off across the central United States and eventually come up here. And there's a thunderstorm. And there's a farmer the next morning standing in his field. And it's completely gone. It looks like Summerfell. And he's shaking his head. And he's saying, I was depending on this. I'm not going to be able to make my payments. What am I going to do? And he looks up, and just a quarter mile away, I'm going to go back to that picture because it's perfect. Just a quarter mile away, his neighbor is standing in his field. And guess what his neighbor got last night? A beautiful rain. Just at the right time, he's going to have a bumper crop. And the farmer stands in his field and he says, I live a good life. I treat my kids well. I go to church every Sunday. I live ethically. I seek to help my neighbors. I thought I was doing everything right. And now this, it's going to ruin me. And my neighbor, he's divorced. He drinks every Friday to oblivion. He lives a terrible life. He's had 5 accidents on our road that I've had to go and pull him out with my tractor because I'm a good guy. And he's going to get the bumper crop. It's not right. It's not just. And if the butterfly had not flapped its wing, the hailstorm would have been a quarter mile further north and hit your neighbor's field instead of yours. That's the butterfly theory. And that's what God says to Job. What he's saying is this. Just try running this universe according to justice for even just one day. It's complex. It's complicated. There's many, many trillions and trillions and trillions of decisions to be made on many topics that you have never even considered as being topics. And you think you can do better than me? And Job says, no, I guess not. I guess not. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what the best decision is, whether the thunderstorm should go a little bit that way or a little bit this way. Maybe I'd have said a bird should have eaten that butterfly before it flapped its wings. There's no way I could have figured out that chain of events that runs across the globe. But everything affects everything. I remember a ski guide. I was having a conversation with a man who trains helicopter ski guides. And he said, I can train them how to ski. I can train them how to have relationships with the people in the group they're guiding. I can train them how to unload and load up skis under a helicopter safely. I can train them how to use the transmitters and the probes and the shovels. I can train them how to do digs in the snowpack to see where it's safe to ski and where it's not safe to ski. But the one most important thing to safety that I can't teach them is the fear of God. He said, these young guys, they come up here, they're better skiers than I am, they're excellent guides, but they think they can conquer the mountain. They think they can understand enough to always be safe, to make a good decision in every situation. He says they'd be much safer if they had the fear of God in them, because the mountain will kill you if you don't respect it. Can't teach you that. How do I conclude? I got to figure this out, right? Before, well, it's after 11:30, so. Let's turn to Job chapter 28. This is one of those places that I think if there was a highlighter in Job that said this part is true and this part is not, this would be one of the true parts, at least according to my estimation. Job 28, verse 20. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds in the sky. Destruction and death say, only a rumor of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and He alone knows where it dwells. For He views the ends of the earth, and He sees everything under the heavens. When He established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when He made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then He looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it. And He said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to shun evil is understanding. All the wisdom of Job's friends, all the wisdom of the world around us is missing the first thing, the fear of God. You see, Job's friends didn't need humility. They didn't need to be humble before God because they had it figured out. They didn't need to wrestle with the problem of suffering because they knew how it worked. And they gave their arguments, and the world better jolly well run according to their wisdom. And Job said, the fear of God. I'm not God. I don't know everything. I don't know which path the thunderstorm should or shouldn't take. I don't know whether the butterfly flapped that wing or this one. So there's things I don't understand. I can think, I can struggle, I can work through it. There's a certain amount of truth and understanding that I can have, but ultimately it is God who knows. Ultimately, it is God. God is just. The world does not always look to me like there's justice. So Job's answer was, show yourself, God. Talk to me. Job wrestled with God. I put it this way. In Job, God says, you are smart, but true wisdom begins when you acknowledge me. We use the fear of the Lord thing frequently, so I tried to use a different word. Maybe it'll land in our minds a little bit differently. Yes, you are smart. You can make good arguments. You can understand many things, but that's not wisdom. Wisdom begins when you acknowledge God is first. God is wise, and it makes me humble. Why did God say that Job spoke the truth about God and his friends didn't? I think it's because Job struggled with God. Job struggled. He didn't accept an easy answer. When we think about struggling with God or wrestling with God, who do we think of in the Bible story first? Many of you know, there's many answers you could give, so I've heard a number of different names, but I was thinking of Jacob. Jacob, if you remember, he was the opposite of Job. He was not a righteous man. Jacob means heel grabber or deceiver, and he lived up to it. He deceived his brother out of his birthright. He deceived his father out of the blessing. His brother vowed to kill him. He ran away and he deceived his father-in-law, and he was not entirely honest with his wives. And he's coming back now to the place where he used to live. And his brother, who has vowed to kill him now, has armies gathered around himself. And Jacob's situation was different than Job's. Job said, I'm righteous. I don't deserve to suffer. And Jacob was saying, I'm unrighteous. I deserve what my brother's going to give me. But I still don't want to die. Jacob was saying, God's blessed me with this family and these children and these flocks and riches, and I don't deserve any of it. And you can tell in his actions that he's expecting to die the next day. He sends his family and stuff away so they don't get caught up in the destruction. He thinks he's going to get what he deserves. And God says, no, you're not going to get what you deserve. I'm going to give you mercy. I'm going to give you grace. And all night long, Jacob struggles with God. And in the morning, God gives Jacob a new name. And what is it? Israel. And what does Israel mean? Struggles with God. And the people of God to this day, the descendants of Jacob, are called struggles with God. God said, Job, you spoke the truth about me. Your friends didn't. What's the truth? Relationships are struggle. Maybe I won't ask you to put up your names, but have any of you ever gone to a marriage seminar or marriage counseling? I can tell you what you learned in one sentence. It's a struggle. It's worth the fight. Relationships are hard. They're going to get you into conflict. Figure out how to fix the conflict. And then there'll be another one. We're in relationship with God. That's what He wants with us. If we're not struggling with God, we're not in relationship with God. We have this sanitized view of the faith that says, oh, if everything's not perfect, if you never have a question for God, if you never have a doubt, you're not a good person of faith. That's just not the biblical example. It's not in the book. Job spoke the truth. Go back and read his words. He said some terrible things about God, and about his friends, and about his life. He never stopped believing. He never stopped believing, but he struggled through it. He did struggle through it. Let me close with a story. There was a man who himself was doing fairly well, but he suffered because of his son. his son had a condition, and sometimes he'd be just the most lovely little boy, just fun to be around, just the way you want it to be. And other times he'd go into fits. He'd get into accidents. He'd break his arms and legs from these fits. He'd play with fire and light things and himself on fire, and just horrible, just devastating, dangerous to be around. And the father was at wit's ends. What did I do to deserve this? I don't know if he said that. The story doesn't quite tell us, but he was suffering, really suffering. He'd been to all the experts. What can you do for my son? None of it made a dent. None of it made a difference. One day he's a nice little boy. The next day, the devil himself. One day this man met Jesus. And he said to Jesus, if you can, that part he said, the next part I'm paraphrasing, would you restore justice? This suffering, we don't deserve it. What did my son ever do? He's not old enough to do enough sin to deserve this kind of suffering. Our families lived well. We don't deserve this kind of suffering. Jesus, if you can, because I'm not sure you can, but if you can, would you heal him? Now insert your own problems into the story. What's your question to Jesus? I'm not sure, Jesus, if you can do anything about this because you haven't yet. What are you waiting for? But if you can, it'd be really appreciated. What's your story? Put it in there. It's called prayer. It's called struggling with God. It's called, according to Job, telling the truth about God. I'm not sure if it's going to happen, Jesus. Sure would be nice. Maybe even you put a deal in there, like Gideon did. If you do this, God, then I'll do this for you. Like, look at this. And God says, yeah, I can make all the butterflies flap all their wings and make anything happen in the world that I want to happen. I don't really need your help. Jesus answered him. Of course Jesus answered him. Jesus wants relationship with you. He wants to talk. He threw the question back at the man. He said, if I can? Who do you think I am? If I can. Of course I can. Jesus said in Mark chapter 9, everything is possible for those who believe. Everything, anything. What did the man say? Because here I believe is wisdom. Does anyone remember the story? Mark chapter 9, verse 24. I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. In one sentence, that's the book of Job. I do believe. I'm not going to give up on you, God. But sometimes I wonder. Sometimes it doesn't seem right. Sometimes it doesn't seem like you're coming through. Sometimes it feels unfair. I do believe. But help my unbelief. It's the same story. It's the same story. In Mark 9, the boy with the demon possession, and the book of Job, story of Moses. Peter, the guy who had the faith to step out of the boat and walk on the water, vowed that he'd never met Jesus. It's the same story. It's always the same story. You might be smart. You might think you've got it all figured out. But wisdom begins when you acknowledge God. Say, He's got it figured out, and I'm trying to figure it out. But don't give up. Don't make your arguments better. Bring them before God. Wrestle in prayer. All night if you have to, and the next day too. It took a long time for Job. God came to him, comforted his heart, gave him an answer that he could accept. But it was a struggle. Here's why. It's not that God's not right. It's not that God doesn't fit. It's that we struggle to fit ourselves into God. When we try to approach God, we don't fit. And so we come to Jesus and we say, change my heart. I believe, but help my unbelief. We come to Jesus and we say, I don't understand this. Why did that happen? And we struggle and we talk and we get into relationship and we believe that the relationship is worth the struggle. The relationship is worth the struggle. We don't become wise until we acknowledge, till we have the fear of the Lord, till we humble ourselves and say, I don't actually have the answer here. I can't accuse God, but I'm not going to stop arguing. Maybe some of us, if we want to know God better, we just need to learn how to argue better. Have you ever had the courage to argue with God? To really argue? Because God said to Job, you spoke the truth about me. And the truth was, God wants a real relationship with you. And real relationships, because we're not perfect, are struggle. You see, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they're in a real relationship. They don't struggle. It's perfect. But when we try to come to know this perfect God, it creates struggle. Because we don't fit. Not yet. We will. At the end of the book of Job, Job fits better into God than he did before at the beginning. But it's a struggle. So I give you that. I think it gives me courage. I hope it gives you courage. It's not safe. The words I'm giving you today are not safe. They are dangerous. Because when you honestly struggle, we don't know where you're going to end up. But they are real. And I do believe they're true. I'm going to ask our worship team to come. And I know I went over time, but as I said, Job, I can't fit it into half an hour. There's so much more we could have gone through.